On a cold February night in 1974, 17-year-old Carla Walker disappeared from a bowling alley parking lot in Fort Worth, Texas. The high school cheerleader had been sitting in her boyfriend's car after a Valentine's Day dance when a stranger ripped open the passenger door, pistol-whipped her boyfriend unconscious, and dragged her into the darkness. 3 days later, her body was found in a culvert near Benbrook Lake. For 46 years, her killer walked free. Then, in September 2020, advanced DNA technology and forensic genetic genealogy finally gave Carla's family the answer they had waited nearly 5 decades to hear. The breakthrough came from DNA extracted from Carla's clothing, preserved since 1974, analyzed by a cutting-edge laboratory that could interpret evidence previous technology couldn't decode. But the revelation of who killed Carla Walker would shock everyone who knew the case. The killer had been hiding in plain sight all along, living just blocks from where he committed his crime, driving past the victim's house nearly every day, even sending his own children to the same high school Carla had attended. If you're captivated by stories of cold cases solved and justice finally served, please subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us share these important stories and honor the victims who deserve to be remembered. The Valentine's Day dance at Western Hills High School was everything 17-year-old Carla Walker had hoped it would be. The cafeteria had been transformed with red and pink decorations, and the theme, "Love is a Kaleidoscope," seemed to capture the swirling emotions of teenage romance that filled the room. Carla had spent hours getting ready, curling her honey blonde hair into soft waves and carefully applying her makeup. She wore a powder blue dress that brought out her eyes, and on her finger sparkled the promise ring that her boyfriend, Rodney McCoy, had given her just months before. Rodney had shown up a little late to pick her up, flustered because he'd forgotten to grab her corsage and had to turn back. When he finally arrived at the Walker home on that Saturday evening, February 16th, 1974, he found Carla waiting with a mix of mild irritation and excitement. But the moment she saw the corsage, her annoyance melted away. At just under 5 feet tall, Carla was tiny, but her personality was anything but small. Her friends described her as someone who smiled and said hello to everyone in the hallways, a girl who made people feel seen and valued. Rodney, the starting quarterback for the Western Hills Cougars, drove his mother's 1969 Ford LTD. He and Carla were the school's it couple, the kind that made other students both envious and inspired. They spent the evening dancing with friends, laughing, and enjoying the simple joy of being young and in love. Carla's older sister, Cindy, would later describe her as a little spitfire who had a stubborn streak but a heart of gold. Carla dreamed of becoming a veterinarian. She loved animals and spent hours volunteering at a local shelter. Her younger brother, Jim, only 12 at the time, looked up to her with the kind of admiration that only a younger sibling can have. After the dance ended, Rodney and Carla decided to cruise around town with some friends, a typical weekend activity for teenagers in Fort Worth. They drove along Camp Bowie Boulevard, stopping at various hangout spots where their classmates congregated. Eventually, they pulled into the parking lot of the Brunswick Ridgelea Bowl, a popular bowling alley, so Carla could use the restroom. The parking lot was still fairly busy with high school students hanging out, talking, and enjoying the mild Texas night. Some were grabbing tacos, others just socializing before heading home. After Carla used the facilities, she and Rodney returned to the Ford LTD. The parking lot had begun to empty out as it approached midnight, and the young couple found themselves alone in the car, parked near the back of the lot. They started kissing, their backs against the passenger door, wrapped up in each other the way teenage sweethearts often are. The windows of the car fogged slightly in the cool February air. Neither of them saw the man approaching. The passenger door suddenly yanked open with violent force. Carla and Rodney, who had been leaning against it, partially tumbled out of the car. Before either of them could fully process what was happening, Rodney felt something hard slam into his head. Blood immediately began streaming down his forehead and into his eyes, blurring his vision. "Stop hitting him!" Carla screamed. Rodney, dazed and disoriented, tried to hold on to Carla, but his grip was failing. He felt another blow to his head, and then another. Through his blood-blurred vision, he could barely make out the outline of a man behind Carla, but he couldn't see the attacker's face. The man pointed something at Rodney's head, pressing it close, just inches away. Rodney heard 3 distinct clicks as the man pulled the trigger. The gun didn't fire. The magazine had fallen out during the struggle, dropping somewhere in the parking lot. But Rodney didn't know that. All he knew was that he was staring down the barrel of what he thought was a loaded gun, his head bleeding profusely, and his girlfriend being dragged from the car. "You're coming with me," the man muttered to Carla. Carla turned her face back toward Rodney one last time. Despite the terror of the moment, despite the gun and the blood and the chaos, she managed to speak clearly. "Rodney, go get Dad. Go get my dad." Those were the last words Rodney McCoy would ever hear Carla Walker say. Then everything went black. Rodney lost consciousness, slumping forward in the driver's seat. When he came to, he wasn't sure how much time had passed. Minutes? Longer? The passenger door was still open. Carla was gone. The parking lot was nearly empty now, just a few scattered cars in the distance. Panic seized him as the reality of what had just happened crashed over him like a wave. Blood still streaming down his face, Rodney started the car and drove as fast as he dared to the Walker home. He didn't go to the police first. He didn't call 911. His only thought was to do exactly what Carla had asked him to do: get her dad. Carla's older sister Cindy was still up when Rodney began pounding on the door after 1 a.m. When she opened it, she was confronted with a horrifying sight. Rodney, blood covering his face and soaking his shirt, screaming incoherently. She could make out only a few words at first. "They've got her! They've got her!" Leighton Walker, Carla's father, rushed to the door. Rodney was crying, trying to explain what had happened through his panic and pain. An attacker, the bowling alley, a gun. Carla taken, Carla gone. Leighton didn't wait for the police. He grabbed his own gun and ran to his truck, speeding toward the bowling alley while his wife Doris called 911. When he arrived at the Ridgelea Bowl parking lot, it was quiet and dark. There was no sign of Carla, no sign of any struggle except for the blood in Rodney's borrowed car. The only evidence left behind was Carla's purse on the ground, and nearby, a magazine clip from a .22 caliber Ruger pistol. Within hours, the Fort Worth Police Department had launched a massive investigation. This wasn't just any missing teenager. The circumstances were unambiguously violent. Rodney had been beaten bloody. Carla had been forcibly taken. And the clock was ticking. Fort Worth in 1974 was a city in transition, growing rapidly, but still maintaining some of its small-town sensibilities. Western Hills High School, where Carla was a junior, sat in a solidly middle-class neighborhood on the south side of the city. The area was safe, or at least everyone had thought so. Parents let their teenage children go to dances and hang out at bowling alleys without much worry. But Carla's disappearance changed that calculus overnight. The investigation moved quickly in those first critical hours. Detectives interviewed Rodney extensively, photographing his injuries and taking his detailed statement. They searched the bowling alley parking lot and recovered the gun magazine. It was a critical piece of evidence, a newer model, 22 Ruger magazine, distinctive enough that it might be traceable. The police put out an alert for Carla, describing what she'd been wearing: her powder blue dress, the corsage from the dance, her promise ring. Officers canvassed the neighborhood around the bowling alley, knocking on doors, asking if anyone had seen or heard anything suspicious. A few people reported seeing cars leaving the parking lot around midnight, but no one could provide a clear description of a suspect or a vehicle. The darkness and the late hour had worked in the attacker's favor. Rodney was treated at a local hospital for his head wounds. The doctors confirmed he'd been struck multiple times with a blunt object, likely the butt of a gun. He had a concussion and would need several stitches, but the physical wounds were nothing compared to the guilt and anguish that already consumed him. He kept replaying those final moments in his mind. What if he'd fought harder? What if he'd seen the attacker coming? What if he'd insisted they go straight home after the dance? The Walker family, meanwhile, was living every parent's worst nightmare. Doris and Leighton sat by the phone, praying it would ring with news that Carla had been found safe. Their other children, Cindy, Jim, and the others, tried to process what had happened to their sister. The house that had been filled with ordinary family routines just hours before was now a command center of anxiety and desperate hope. The hours stretched into a day, then 2 days. Police organized search parties to comb through vacant lots, abandoned buildings, and rural areas around Fort Worth. Volunteers joined, including many students from Western Hills High School. Everyone who knew Carla wanted to help bring her home. On February 20th, 1974, 3 days after Carla's disappearance, a patrol officer was conducting a routine check of rural areas south of Fort Worth when he noticed something in a culvert near Benbrook Lake, about 9 miles from the bowling alley. The location was remote, accessible only by a rough dirt road that led off the main highway. The culvert was a concrete drainage pipe, the kind designed to channel water under roadways. Inside, partially hidden, was a body. It was Carla Walker. The crime scene investigators from the Fort Worth Police Department arrived quickly. Even for seasoned officers, the scene was difficult to process. Carla was lying on her back, her powder blue dress torn and stained. The medical examiner would later determine that she had been sexually assaulted, beaten, and strangled. Her legs bore deep gashes and bruises. Toxicology reports would reveal she had been injected with morphine at some point during her ordeal. Perhaps most horrifying was the timeline. Based on the condition of the body and other forensic evidence, investigators determined that Carla had been kept alive for approximately 2 days after her abduction. 2 days during which she endured unimaginable terror and pain. 2 days during which her family desperately searched and prayed. 2 days during which her killer held complete power over her. The Fort Worth Police Department was one of the few law enforcement agencies in the country at that time to have its own crime laboratory. The investigators meticulously collected evidence from the scene. They carefully bagged Carla's clothing, her dress, her undergarments, her shoes. They took samples from her body. They photographed everything. They knew they were dealing with a sadistic predator, and they were determined to use every tool at their disposal to catch him. But in 1974, those tools were limited. DNA analysis didn't exist. Forensic science was in its relative infancy. What the investigators did have was determination and some physical evidence that might prove useful someday. They preserved everything carefully, storing it in the department's evidence room, hoping that somehow, someday, it would lead them to Carla's killer. The funeral for Carla Walker was held on a gray, cold day that matched the mood of everyone in attendance. The church was packed with mourners, family, friends, Classmates, teachers, community members who had never even met Carla, but were shaken by the brutality of her death. Rodney McCoy sat with the family, his head still bandaged, his face a mask of grief and guilt. He would carry that guilt for decades. The investigation into Carla's murder became one of the most intensive efforts the Fort Worth Police Department had ever undertaken. In March 1974, just weeks after the murder, investigators formed a special task force. They were looking for patterns, for similar crimes, for any connection that might lead them to the killer. The impact of Carla's murder on Fort Worth was profound and far-reaching. Western Hills High School, which had been preparing for spring activities and looking forward to graduation, was plunged into collective mourning. Counselors were brought in to help students process their grief and fear. The Valentine's dance, which had been an annual tradition for decades, was canceled for several years following Carla's death. When it was eventually reinstated, it was never quite the same. There was always an undercurrent of remembered tragedy, a sense that innocence had been lost. Parents throughout Fort Worth suddenly became much more protective of their teenage children. The freedom that teenagers had enjoyed, cruising around town on weekend nights, hanging out in parking lots, going to dances without much supervision, was curtailed. Curfews became stricter. Parents insisted on knowing exactly where their children would be and when they would be home. The bowling alley parking lot, once a popular teen hangout, became a place parents warned their children to avoid. The local media covered the case extensively. The Fort Worth Star-Telegram ran front-page stories for weeks, detailing the investigation's progress and publishing photographs of Carla, keeping her face in the public consciousness. Television news stations provided regular updates. The coverage was intense and sustained, reflecting both genuine public interest and the shocking nature of the crime. Some of the early coverage included details about an incident that had occurred the night before Carla's disappearance. Carla and Rodney had been bugged by another youth at a local restaurant called Mr. Quick's on Friday night, February 15th. This person had bothered them, made them uncomfortable in some way. For a time, investigators wondered if this incident might be connected to what happened the following night. They tracked down and interviewed the individual, but he had an alibi for the time of Carla's abduction and was eventually cleared. It was just another dead end, another false lead in an investigation that would have many. The Walker family's home became a gathering place for concerned community members. People brought food, offered support, organized prayer vigils. The family was overwhelmed by the outpouring of sympathy, but nothing could truly comfort them. Their daughter was gone, murdered in the most brutal way, and no amount of casseroles or kind words could change that reality. Leighton Walker, Carla's father, threw himself into the investigation with an intensity that worried his family. He spent hours at the police station, reviewing evidence, suggesting leads, demanding updates. He contacted psychics and private investigators, anyone who might be able to help. He mortgaged the family home to pay for reward money, eventually offering thousands of dollars for information, leading to the arrest of his daughter's killer. His obsession with finding justice was understandable, but it also took a toll on his health and his relationships. He became consumed by the case, unable to think about anything else. Doris Walker, Carla's mother, grieved more quietly, but no less deeply. She kept Carla's room exactly as it had been on the night she died. The clothes still in the closet, the posters on the walls, the stuffed animals on the bed. She would sit in that room for hours, sometimes talking to Carla as if she were still there, praying for answers that didn't come. For Jim Walker, who was in 7th grade when his sister was murdered, the experience fundamentally shaped his developing worldview. he lost not just a sister, but also a sense of security, a belief that the world was fundamentally safe and just. He watched his parents suffer and felt powerless to help them. He endured questions from classmates, some curious, some cruelly insensitive. He learned at a young age that evil was real, that terrible things happened to good people, and that justice was not always swift or certain. Rodney McCoy's suffering was compounded by the weight of survivors' guilt and the sting of suspicion. In the immediate aftermath of the murder, he was questioned extensively by police, which was entirely appropriate given that he was the only witness, but which also planted seeds of doubt in some people's minds. Why hadn't he been able to protect Carla? Why had he survived when she hadn't? Could his story be trusted? These questions, rarely voiced directly, but always hovering in the background, haunted him. Some of Carla's extended family and friends struggled with conflicting emotions about Rodney. They knew, rationally, that he was a victim too, that he had been viciously attacked and could easily have been killed himself. But there was also an irrational part of their grief that wanted to blame someone, and Rodney was the person who had been there, who had been responsible for taking care of Carla that night. These unspoken tensions added another layer of tragedy to an already heartbreaking situation. The gun magazine became a crucial lead. Investigators contacted the Federal Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and requested a list of everyone in the Fort Worth area who had purchased a newer Model 22 Ruger pistol that used that specific type of magazine. The ATF came back with a list of about 24 names. Detectives began the painstaking process of interviewing each person on that list. One of those names was Glenn Samuel McCurley, a 31-year-old truck driver who lived in West Fort Worth, less than 2 miles from the Walker family home and just blocks from the bowling alley where Carla had been taken. 2 detectives arrived at McCurley's house in early April 1974. He lived there with his wife, Judy, and their 2 young sons. The house was modest but well kept, situated in a quiet, working-class neighborhood. McCurley came to the door and spoke with the detectives calmly. Yes, he said, he had purchased a .22 Ruger pistol, but it had been stolen from his truck about 6 weeks ago, right around the time of Carla's murder. He hadn't reported it stolen, he explained, because he was an ex-convict. He'd served time for car theft years earlier, and he was worried about getting in trouble for not properly securing a firearm. The detectives asked McCurley about his whereabouts on the night of February 16th and the morning of February 17th. McCurley said he'd worked until 4:30 p.m. on the 16th at his trucking job. His wife had gone to West Texas to visit family, so he'd been home alone that evening and the next day. He said he'd probably had a few beers, watched some TV, and gone to bed. Nothing unusual, just a quiet weekend at home. The detectives asked if McCurley would be willing to take a polygraph test to help eliminate him as a suspect. McCurley agreed without hesitation. He went to the police station, submitted to the polygraph examination, and according to the examiner's assessment, he passed. His story seemed to check out. He claimed his gun had been stolen. He had no obvious connection to Carla Walker or her boyfriend. He appeared cooperative and truthful. Glenn McCurley was eliminated as a suspect. The investigation continued for months, then years. Detectives pursued dozens of leads, interviewed hundreds of people, and investigated multiple potential suspects. There were tips that seemed promising at first, but led nowhere. There were theories about strangers passing through Fort Worth, about serial killers operating in Texas at that time, about connections to other unsolved crimes. One piece of evidence that particularly intrigued investigators was a mysterious letter that arrived at the police department in early 1974, not long after Carla's murder. The anonymous letter writer claimed to know who had killed Carla Walker and provided some details about the crime. The letter was signed only with a string of ones and zeros. Despite extensive efforts to trace its origin and decipher its meaning, the letter remained a tantalizing but ultimately unhelpful clue. Decades later, when the case was finally solved, detectives would confirm that the letter had nothing to do with the actual killer and was likely sent by someone seeking attention or by a person with mental illness who had read about the case in the newspapers. As the years passed, the Carla Walker case joined the ranks of cold cases, unsolved murders that haunt police departments and families alike. The case file grew thicker with dead-end leads and investigative reports, but the fundamental question remained unanswered. Who killed Carla Walker? For Rodney McCoy, life after Carla's death was never the same. The guilt he felt was crushing. He couldn't shake the feeling that he should have protected her, that he had failed her in her moment of greatest need. After graduating from high school, he left Fort Worth, moving to Alaska to work on an oil rig. He needed to get as far away as possible from the place where he'd lost Carla and where suspicion, however faint, had sometimes been directed at him. Some people wondered if he knew more than he'd said. Some questioned whether his story was entirely accurate. These suspicions were never substantiated, but they added to his torment. Eventually, Rodney returned to Texas and built a new life. He married and started a family, but he never forgot Carla. He never stopped wondering who had taken her from him that night. For the Walker family, the pain was equally profound and enduring. Leighton Walker, Carla's father, became consumed with finding his daughter's killer. He spent thousands of dollars on private investigators, following up on leads the police couldn't pursue, chasing any fragment of hope that justice might be served. He died in the 1990s without ever knowing who had murdered his little girl. Doris Walker, Carla's mother, carried her grief with a quiet dignity. She kept Carla's room much as it had been, holding on to the physical remnants of her daughter's brief life. She, too, passed away without seeing justice for Carla. Jim Walker, who had been just 12 years old when his sister was killed, grew up in the shadow of her murder. The case shaped his entire life, coloring his worldview and leaving him with a deep sense of incomplete mourning. He became, in many ways, the keeper of Carla's memory, the family member who would continue pushing for answers long after his parents were gone. The decades rolled on. The 1970s gave way to the 1980s, then the 1990s, then the 2000s. Fort Worth changed and grew. New generations of police officers joined the department, many of whom had never worked the original Carla Walker case, but knew it by reputation. The case file sat in the cold case archives, occasionally reviewed when a new detective took an interest or when a potential lead emerged, but essentially dormant. Meanwhile, Glenn McCurley continued living his life in Fort Worth. He and his wife Judy raised their two sons, both of whom attended Western Hills High School, the same school Carla had attended. Every school day, McCurley drove his sons past the Walker family home on their way to school. He lived a quiet, unremarkable life as a truck driver. His neighbors knew him as a polite, helpful man. He had no further trouble with the law. He maintained the reputation of a model citizen, someone who had made a mistake in his youth, but had gone straight and lived an honest life. The audacity of McCurley's hidden life is almost incomprehensible. He wasn't just a killer who had evaded justice. He was a killer who continued to exist within the very community he had devastated. His children went to Carla's school. He drove past her family's home regularly. He shopped at the same stores, attended local events, lived his life as if nothing had happened. All the while, Carla's family was trapped in an endless cycle of grief and unanswered questions just blocks away. McCurley's wife, Judy, apparently had no idea about her husband's crime. She had been out of town visiting family in West Texas when Carla was murdered, returning home to find police interest in her husband's gun ownership, but nothing that seemed particularly alarming at the time. She believed his story about the stolen gun. She believed him when he said he'd passed the polygraph test and been cleared. She built a life with him, raised children with him, trusted him completely. How does someone carry such a secret for 46 years? Psychologists who study violent criminals note that some individuals possess an extraordinary capacity for compartmentalization, the ability to separate different aspects of their lives so completely that they can commit horrific acts and then return to normalcy as if nothing happened. They can be loving fathers and brutal killers, helpful neighbors and sadistic predators. The contradictions don't seem to trouble them because they've built internal walls between these different identities. McCurley worked as a truck driver for much of his adult life, a job that took him away from home regularly and provided both income and mobility. Truck drivers can travel extensively across state lines, staying in different towns and cities, interacting with countless strangers, and then moving on. For someone with violent inclinations, it's an occupation that provides opportunities. This is part of why investigators came to suspect that Carla Walker wasn't McCurley's only victim. During the decades when the case was cold, there were periodic attempts to revive it. New detectives would be assigned to the cold case unit and would review the files, looking for something that had been missed. Occasionally, someone would come forward with a tip, claiming to have information about the murder. Each time, investigators would follow up, hoping this might be the breakthrough. Each time, the leads would fizzle out, leaving the case as frustratingly unsolved as ever. In the 1990s, as DNA technology first emerged as a forensic tool, there was hope that the evidence from Carla's case might finally be useful. The Fort Worth Police Department sent samples to laboratories for analysis, but the technology at that time wasn't sophisticated enough to extract a usable profile from the degraded evidence. The DNA was there, but it couldn't be properly read or interpreted. It was like having a document in a language no one could yet translate. As the case grew older, some people began to assume it would never be solved. The original investigators retired or passed away, taking their institutional knowledge with them. The witnesses from 1974 aged, and their memories, never perfect to begin with, faded further. Physical evidence degraded with time despite best efforts at preservation. The case file grew thicker with dead ends and false leads, becoming a testament to exhaustive but ultimately fruitless effort. But some people never gave up. Jim Walker, in particular, became the keeper of his sister's memory and the advocate for continued investigation. He maintained contact with the Fort Worth Police Department, checking in periodically to see if there were any developments. He wrote letters to legislators about the importance of funding for cold case investigations. He attended community meetings and spoke about Carla, ensuring that her story wasn't forgotten. Jim also connected with other families of unsolved murder victims, finding a community of people who understood the particular agony of living without answers. These families supported each other, shared information about advances in forensic science, and advocated together for better resources for cold case investigations. They formed bonds forged in shared tragedy, united by their refusal to let their loved ones be forgotten. The Fort Worth Police Department, despite limited resources, never officially closed the Carla Walker case. It remained an open investigation, even if it wasn't being actively worked most of the time. The evidence was carefully maintained in the department's storage facility, protected from deterioration as much as possible. When new detectives joined the cold case unit, The Carla Walker file was often one of the first they reviewed. It was that significant, that notorious, that important. In the early 2000s, advances in DNA technology raised hopes again. Techniques for extracting DNA from small or degraded samples were improving. The Fort Worth Police Department submitted evidence from Carla's case for retesting, but again, the results were disappointing. While they could confirm that male DNA was present on Carla's clothing, they still couldn't develop a complete enough profile to search against databases or make comparisons. The technology was getting better, but it wasn't there yet. What Jim Walker and others didn't know was that one day the technology would finally catch up. One day, a new approach combining DNA analysis with genealogical research would revolutionize cold case investigations. One day, the evidence that had been carefully preserved for decades would finally reveal its secrets. His secret remained buried for 46 years. The modern era of forensic science began to change the landscape of cold case investigations in the early 2000s. DNA analysis, which had been developed in the 1980s and gradually refined through the 1990s, became increasingly sophisticated. By the 2010s, techniques that seemed like science fiction just decades earlier were becoming routine tools for investigators. But the Carla Walker case presented particular challenges. The DNA collected from her clothing in 1974 was degraded, damaged by time and the conditions of storage. Early attempts to create a usable DNA profile from the evidence had failed. The samples were simply too weak, too contaminated, too broken down to produce the kind of complete genetic profile that could be compared against databases or used to identify a suspect. In 2017, something unexpected breathed new life into the case. A true crime enthusiast named Vincent Strange. Strange was a 40-year-old Fort Worth aerospace technician who had a passion for researching unsolved murders. He had decided to start a podcast about Texas cold cases, and the Carla Walker murder was going to be his first story. As Strange began researching the case, he became fascinated by the details. He read old newspaper articles, interviewed people who remembered the investigation, and studied everything he could find about the crime. His wife, Erica, encouraged his work, believing that public attention on cold cases could sometimes shake loose new information or bring pressure on law enforcement to reinvest resources in solving them. Strange reached out to Paul Holes, a renowned forensic investigator who had become famous for his work on the Golden State Killer case. Holes had pioneered the use of forensic genetic genealogy, a cutting-edge technique that combined DNA analysis with genealogical research to identify suspects through their family trees. When Holes heard about the Carla Walker case, he was intrigued. He reached out to the Fort Worth Police Department to see if he could help. At the same time, two Fort Worth detectives, Leah Wagner and Jeff Bennett, had been assigned to review cold cases. Both were experienced investigators, but neither had worked the original Carla Walker investigation. As they dug into the case file, they were struck by several things. First, the investigation had been thorough and professional. The original detectives had done good work with the tools available to them in 1974. Second, the evidence had been carefully preserved. And third, there was a nagging question about some of the original suspects who had been eliminated. Wagner and Bennett learned about the contact from Paul Holes and decided to explore whether new DNA technology might be able to extract information from the old evidence. But there was a problem. DNA testing was expensive, especially the advanced techniques that might be necessary to work with such degraded samples. The Fort Worth Police Department had limited budget for cold case investigations, and spending tens of thousands of dollars on a decades-old murder, while morally compelling, was difficult to justify financially when there were active investigations demanding resources. That's when Oxygen, the true crime television network, stepped in. The network was developing a show called The DNA of Murder with Paul Holes, and they were looking for compelling cases to feature. Oxygen agreed to pay for advanced DNA testing of the evidence in the Carla Walker case. The cost would be approximately $20,000, far more than the police department could have allocated on its own. The evidence was sent to Othram Inc., a private DNA laboratory in the Woodlands, Texas. Othram specialized in forensic genetic genealogy and had developed proprietary techniques for analyzing extremely degraded or contaminated DNA samples. Their laboratory was equipped with cutting-edge technology that could extract and amplify DNA fragments that traditional methods couldn't handle. The scientists at Othram went to work on Carla's dress, particularly focusing on a stain on the bra strap where male DNA had been detected decades earlier but never successfully profiled. Using advanced sequencing techniques, they were able to construct a genetic profile, not a complete one, but enough markers to begin the process of genetic genealogy. The way forensic genetic genealogy works is complex but revolutionary. Instead of comparing DNA directly to a criminal database like CODIS, investigators upload the DNA profile to public genealogy databases like GEDmatch, where millions of people have voluntarily submitted their DNA in hopes of finding relatives or learning about their ancestry. The DNA from the crime scene doesn't need to exactly match anyone in the database. Instead, it can match distant relatives, third cousins, fourth cousins, even more distant relations. Once a match is found, a genetic genealogist begins building family trees, working both forward and backward through generations, using public records, census data, birth certificates, death certificates, marriage records, and other documents to map out the branches of the family tree. The goal is to identify the most recent common ancestor between the person whose DNA is in the database and the unknown suspect. Then, by working forward through the generations, the genealogist can narrow down potential suspects to a small group of individuals who would be the right age, gender, and location. In July 2020, Othram called Detective Jeff Bennett with news that sent a jolt through him. They had successfully created a genetic profile from the DNA on Carla's dress. More than that, they had uploaded it to genealogy databases and found familial matches. The genetic genealogist working on the case had built out family trees and traced lines of descent. They had narrowed the suspect pool to 3 brothers who shared a specific surname. The name was McCurley. Bennett's hands were shaking as he looked through the old case files. There it was, Glenn Samuel McCurley, interviewed in April 1974, owner of a stolen .22 Ruger pistol, polygraph administered and passed, eliminated as a suspect. But now, 46 years later, his family's DNA was pointing directly at him. Bennett and Wagner knew they needed to be certain before making an arrest. Genealogy matches, while powerful, weren't enough on their own. They needed to confirm that Glenn McCurley's DNA specifically matched the DNA from the crime scene. They began surveillance of McCurley's house. On July 7, 2020, detectives collected trash from the bin in front of McCurley's residence. It's a perfectly legal investigative technique. Once trash is placed on the curb for collection, it's considered public domain and can be examined by law enforcement without a warrant. The items from McCurley's trash were sent for DNA analysis. On September 4, 2020, the lab results came back. The DNA from McCurley's trash matched the male DNA profile found on Carla's clothing. The match was definitive. After 46 years, 5 months, and 18 days, investigators finally knew who had killed Carla Walker. But before making an arrest, Wagner and Bennett decided on one more step. They wanted to give McCurley a chance to explain himself, to see if he would admit his involvement if confronted directly. Sometimes, facing the undeniable proof of modern science, even decades-old secrets come tumbling out. On September 10, 2020, Detectives Wagner and Bennett knocked on the door of the McCurley home. Glenn answered, now 77 years old, his hair white, his face lined with age. His wife Judy was home as well. Wagner explained that they were reopening the Carla Walker murder investigation and were re-interviewing everyone who had been questioned back in 1974. It was a huge case, she said. They noticed that McCurley had been interviewed decades ago and wanted to follow up. McCurley seemed calm, even helpful. He reiterated what he'd said in 1974. His gun had been stolen. He'd been home alone that weekend. He didn't know anything about the murder. Wagner asked if he would be willing to provide a DNA sample, explaining that it would be the easiest way to definitively eliminate him as a suspect after all these years. She presented it as a simple matter of closing the loop, making sure every lead was thoroughly exhausted. McCurley hesitated for just a moment. Then he signed the consent form and allowed Wagner to swab the inside of his cheek with a Q-tip. Judy McCurley, sitting nearby, said something that would prove haunting in retrospect. I hope you find out who did it. That girl needs to be remembered as someone who mattered. 11 days later, on September 21, 2020, members of the U.S. Marshals North Texas Fugitive Task Force arrived at McCurley's house with an arrest warrant. Glenn McCurley was taken into custody and charged with capital murder in the death of Carla Walker. The news exploded across Fort Worth and then nationally. A cold case from 1974, unsolved for nearly half a century, had finally been cracked through DNA technology. Local news stations ran extensive coverage. National networks picked up the story. True crime podcasts and blogs dissected every detail. For Jim Walker, Carla's younger brother who was now in his late 50s, the news was overwhelming. He held a press conference alongside Fort Worth police officials, his voice breaking with emotion as he spoke. Finally, he said, his eyes filling with tears. After 46 years, 5 months, and 3 days, we have a name, a face, and are working toward a complete resolution. This is a resolution that's been prayed for by many people for years now. Jim Walker spoke about his parents, both long dead, never knowing who had killed their daughter. He spoke about the dark times when he wondered if anyone would ever be caught. And he spoke about forgiveness. We are praying for the suspect's family, he said. What happened to my sister is not their fault. For Rodney McCoy, now 65 years old, the news brought a complex mix of emotions. On one hand, there was overwhelming relief. For 46 years, he had carried not just grief, but also the burden of suspicion. Some people had always wondered about his story, questioned whether he had been completely truthful, speculated about his possible involvement. The DNA evidence definitively proved what he had always maintained. He was a victim that night too, not a perpetrator. He had told the truth. He had done nothing wrong except fail to prevent something that no teenager could have been expected to prevent. But relief was tangled with renewed guilt and trauma. Learning the killer's identity didn't erase the question that had tormented Rodney for decades. What if he had fought harder? What if he had saved her? He hung a cloud of suspicion on me for all those years, Rodney said in an interview after McCurley's arrest. That's torment. I just felt I let Mr. Walker down, he said. Take care of my little flower. When police searched McCurley's house after his arrest, they made a chilling discovery. Hidden in a compartment above a doorframe in a room that McCurley had built himself, wrapped in a towel, was the .22 Ruger pistol he had claimed was stolen in 1974. The gun had been in his house all along, concealed for 46 years. McCurley was held on a $500,000 bond. His defense attorneys argued that he was an elderly, sick man, he had diabetes and cancer, who posed no threat to anyone. But prosecutors successfully argued that the brutality of the crime and McCurley's decades of deception warranted the high bond. He remained in custody. In the weeks following his arrest, McCurley was questioned extensively by detectives. The interrogation was videotaped, as is standard practice. What unfolded over several hours was a slow, painful extraction of truth from a man who had kept his secret for nearly half a century. At first, McCurley denied everything. He repeated his old story. The gun was stolen. He didn't know anything about Carla Walker's murder. There must be some mistake with the DNA. But Wagner and Bennett were patient and persistent. They explained the science. They showed him the genetic genealogy results. They explained how they had traced his family tree, how they had collected his DNA from his trash, how they had confirmed the match. The evidence was irrefutable. As the hours wore on, McCurley's denials began to crack. He admitted he had been drinking heavily that night in February 1974, whiskey and beer. He admitted he had been driving around Fort Worth, looking for something, though he couldn't quite articulate what. Then he broke down crying. "I did do it, I guess," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. He claimed he had been drunk and that the whole thing was a blur. He said he saw the couple in the car, and something in him snapped. He tried to minimize what he had done, claiming at various points that Carla had gone with him willingly, or that he hadn't intended to hurt her. He denied sexually assaulting her, despite the forensic evidence. He claimed she was still alive when he left her in the culvert, though the medical evidence clearly showed otherwise. The detectives listening to his confession were struck by how confusing and contradictory his statements were. At times, McCurley seemed to be mixing up details, as if he were confusing Carla's murder with other crimes. The way he described certain aspects of the attack didn't quite match the known facts of the case. This raised a disturbing question. Had Glenn McCurley killed other women? Investigators began looking into unsolved murders from the 1970s and 1980s in the Fort Worth area. They identified at least 3 cases that bore striking similarities to Carla Walker's murder. Young women abducted from cars or parking lots, sexually assaulted, and strangled. In each case, the investigations had gone cold. In each case, the killer had never been identified. Becky Martin, a 19-year-old woman, had been murdered in 1973, just months before Carla. Christy Tower, 26, had been killed in 1983. June Ward, 34, had been murdered in 1984. All 3 cases remained unsolved. All 3 bore McCurley's signature methods. But without DNA evidence linking him to those crimes, and without a confession, prosecutors couldn't charge him with additional murders. McCurley never admitted to killing anyone other than Carla Walker, but investigators remained convinced that he was responsible for multiple deaths, that Carla was not his only victim, but merely the one whose case had finally been solved. Glenn McCurley's trial was scheduled to begin in August 2021. Prosecutors announced that they would not seek the death penalty, citing McCurley's age and health. He would face a maximum sentence of life in prison if convicted. The courtroom was packed on the first day of testimony. Jim Walker and his sister Cindy were there, along with other family members. Rodney McCoy was there, prepared to testify about the worst night of his life. McCurley's own family attended as well. His wife Judy, his sons, relatives who were struggling to reconcile the man they knew with the monster he had been accused of being. McCurley entered the courtroom in a wheelchair, dressed in a white button-down shirt and black pants. He looked frail and elderly, nothing like the 31-year-old predator who had stalked the bowling alley parking lot in 1974. Rodney McCoy was the first major witness called by the prosecution. Now 65 years old, he took the stand and recounted the events of February 16 to 17, 1974, in painstaking detail. His voice remained steady as he described taking Carla to the Valentine's Day dance, going to the bowling alley, parking in the lot, beginning to kiss her. Then his voice began to waver as he described what happened next, the door yanking open, both of them falling partially out of the car, being hit on the head, blood streaming down his face and into his eyes. I remember I was holding her, and the blood started flowing down my forehead, down into my eyes, he testified. I'm not sure how many times I got hit. I believe it was more than once, according to Carla's reaction. She screamed, "Stop hitting him." He described the gun being pointed at his head, the 3 clicks of the trigger, the terror of believing he was about to die. He pulled the trigger 3 times, McCoy said, and all I heard were the 3 clicks. Nothing came out of the gun. Then he recounted Carla's last words to him, his voice breaking completely. Carla turned her face to me, and I can visualize, and said, "Rodney, go get Dad. Go get my dad." That's the last words I heard from Carla. There wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom. The prosecutors then presented the physical evidence. They carefully unfolded Carla's powder blue dress, the one she had worn to the dance, now stained and torn, preserved for 46 years. They presented the bra where the DNA had been found. They showed photographs of the crime scene, of Carla's body in the culvert, of her injuries. The prosecution played large portions of McCurley's videotaped confession from September 2020. The courtroom watched as the elderly man on the screen denied and minimized before finally, tearfully admitting, "I did do it, I guess." Then came the surprise evidence, the .22 Ruger pistol, found hidden in McCurley's home. Prosecutors held it up for the jury to see. This was the gun McCurley had claimed was stolen in 1974. This was the gun that had been used to pistol whip Rodney McCoy, and McCurley had kept it, hidden away, for 46 years. The defense attorneys tried to cast doubt on the DNA evidence, suggesting that the samples could have been contaminated over the decades of storage. They argued that McCurley's confession had been coerced, that he was a sick, elderly man who had been questioned for hours and simply told detectives what they wanted to hear. They painted him as a man who had lived a quiet, law-abiding life for nearly 5 decades, suggesting that one mistake in his youth, if indeed he was guilty at all, shouldn't define his entire existence. But the evidence was overwhelming. The DNA didn't lie. The genealogy was sound. The trash collection had been legal. The confession, whatever its flaws and contradictions, was fundamentally an admission of guilt. On the 3rd day of the trial, something unexpected happened. McCurley, after consulting with his attorneys during a recess, changed his plea to guilty. He admitted to capital murder in the kidnapping, sexual assault, and murder of Carla Walker. Judge Elizabeth Beach accepted the guilty plea and immediately sentenced McCurley to life in prison without the possibility of parole. There would be no lengthy deliberation, no uncertainty about the verdict. It was over. After the sentencing, Jim Walker and Cindy Stone were allowed to make victim impact statements. Jim walked directly up to McCurley, standing just a few feet from him, looking into the face of the man who had murdered his sister 46 years ago. "You've done this to other families," Jim said, his voice firm despite his emotions. "And you need to confess and bring closure to these other victims' families." McCurley kept his eyes fixed on the floor. He said nothing. In a moment that captured national attention, Jim Walker then walked over to McCurley's sons, both of whom were devastated by their father's crimes, and embraced them. He comforted them, acknowledging that they too were victims in a sense, having learned that their father was a murderer. Outside the courtroom, Jim Walker spoke to reporters about forgiveness. "We don't hate him," he said, referring to McCurley. "We're praying for him and his family. It's not their fault. But prayers and forgiveness don't come with a get-out-of-jail-free card. Justice has been served." Rodney McCoy also spoke to the press after the trial. "It's been 47 years, he said. "I had a cloud of suspicion on me for all those years. That's torment. But now," he said, "he finally had closure. The truth was known. Carla's killer had been caught. Justice, delayed by nearly half a century, had finally been served." McCurley was transported to the Gibb Lewis unit, a state prison in Texas. According to the terms of his sentence, he would be eligible for parole consideration on March 21, 2029, when he would be 86 years old. But that consideration would never come. On July 15, 2023, less than 2 years into his sentence, Glenn Samuel McCurley died in prison of natural causes. He was 79 years old. The man who had murdered Carla Walker and possibly several other women, who had hidden his crimes for 46 years, who had walked free while his victim's family mourned and searched for answers, was gone. His death meant that the families of other potential victims would likely never get the closure that the Walker family had received. McCurley had taken whatever other secrets he held to his grave. The Carla Walker case became a landmark in the field of forensic science and cold case investigation. It demonstrated the power of forensic genetic genealogy and advanced DNA analysis to solve crimes that had seemed unsolvable. It showed that evidence carefully preserved, even decades ago, could still yield answers when examined with modern technology. The case also inspired legislative action. In December 2024, U.S. Senators John Cornyn of Texas and Peter Welch of Vermont introduced the Carla Walker Act, a bill designed to provide federal funding for advanced DNA testing and forensic genetic genealogy in cold cases across the country. The legislation would create a pilot program to help law enforcement agencies access the same cutting-edge technology that had solved Carla's murder. 46 years after Carla Walker's tragic murder left her family desperately seeking answers, her killer was finally identified and brought to justice thanks to advanced DNA analysis, Senator Cornyn said when introducing the bill. "I'm proud to introduce this legislation in Carla Walker's honor so that we can provide the resources needed to give more families in Texas and across the country the peace, healing, and resolution that comes through the power of a case solved." Jim Walker became an advocate for forensic technology in cold cases, working with the foundation that Detective Jeff Bennett had created to help fund DNA testing for other unsolved murders. He spoke at conferences and to legislators, sharing his family's story and emphasizing the importance of never giving up on cases, no matter how old. "There are so many Carla Walker families out there," Jim said in an interview. "So many Carla Walkers quietly crying for justice, for resolution, for some answers. This technology can help them." For the Fort Worth Police Department, the successful resolution of the Carla Walker case led to renewed efforts on other cold cases. Detectives Wagner and Bennett continued investigating unsolved murders from the 1970s and 1980s, focusing particularly on the cases they believed might be connected to Glenn McCurley. They hoped that evidence from those crimes might also yield DNA that could be analyzed with modern technology. The true crime podcasters and content creators who had helped bring attention to Carla's case also continued their work. Vincent Strange, the aerospace technician who had originally set out to tell Carla's story for his podcast, watched as the case was solved in real time, far faster than he could have imagined when he first started his research. The case became a featured story on multiple television programs, including NBC's Dateline and Oxygen's documentary series. But perhaps the most important legacy of the Carla Walker case was the message it sent to families of other victims. Don't give up hope. Evidence can be preserved. Technology advances. Cold cases can be solved, even after decades. Justice, though delayed, can still arrive. Carla's grave in a Fort Worth cemetery had been visited regularly by her family over the years. Her headstone, with its simple inscription of her name and dates, marked the resting place of a girl whose life had been violently cut short at 17. Now, nearly 5 decades after her death, visitors sometimes left notes along with flowers, notes saying that justice had been served, that Carla was remembered, that her story had helped change how cold cases were investigated. Rodney McCoy, in one of his final interviews about the case, reflected on what Carla's memory meant to him. She was planning to be a veterinarian, he said, his voice soft. She loved animals. She was kind. She had this stubborn streak, but she was one of the sweetest people you'd ever meet. That's what I want people to remember about Carla. Not just how she died, but how she lived. The promise ring he had given her, the one Carla was wearing the night she was murdered, had been recovered with her body and returned to her family. After McCurley's conviction, detectives returned the ring to Rodney. It was a small gesture, but a meaningful one, a physical reminder of a love story that had been cut short by violence, but that had never truly ended. In the years since McCurley's death, investigators have continued to look into whether he might be connected to other unsolved cases, not just in Fort Worth, but across Texas and even in other states. As a truck driver, McCurley had traveled extensively throughout his career, providing opportunity to commit crimes far from his home. Some law enforcement agencies have submitted DNA evidence from their cold cases for comparison against McCurley's genetic profile, hoping to finally close cases that have haunted them for decades. The Walker family established a scholarship fund in Carla's name at Western Hills High School, providing financial assistance to students who, like Carla, dreamed of careers helping animals. It was a fitting tribute to a girl whose life had been defined by kindness and compassion, whose promise had been stolen, but whose memory continued to inspire good in the world. The bowling alley where Carla was taken no longer exists. The building was torn down years ago, replaced by a shopping center. But those who remember February 1974 still know the spot, still feel a chill when they pass by. The culvert near Benbrook Lake where Carla's body was found is still there, hidden from the road, a silent witness to horror. Some people who know the case's history have placed small memorials there over the years, flowers, crosses, notes, marking it as a place where a young life was taken. Glenn McCurley's house, where he lived for decades after murdering Carla, still stands. His family no longer lives there. New residents occupy it now, likely unaware of its dark history. The house looks like any other on the street, ordinary, unremarkable, giving no hint that a killer once lived within its walls, that a murder weapon was hidden in a secret compartment, that evidence of one of Fort Worth's most notorious crimes was concealed there for nearly half a century. The story of Carla Walker is, at its core, a story about the persistence of truth. For 46 years, Glenn McCurley believed he had gotten away with murder. He had passed a polygraph test. He had lived a seemingly normal life. He had raised children, gone to work, been a neighbor and community member. He had hidden in plain sight, protected by the limitations of 1970s forensic science, and by his own willingness to lie. But truth has a way of emerging, even after decades. Science advanced, technology improved. Dedicated investigators refused to let the case die. And ultimately, DNA, the microscopic building blocks of life that McCurley had left on Carla's clothing in his moment of violence, became his undoing. The resolution of the Carla Walker case brought different forms of closure to different people. For Jim Walker, it meant finally being able to properly mourn his sister, knowing that justice had been served. For Rodney McCoy, it meant the lifting of a burden of suspicion he had carried for nearly 5 decades. For the Fort Worth Police Department, it meant closing one of the most notorious cases in the city's history and demonstrating that they never stop working for victims, no matter how much time has passed. But closure doesn't erase trauma. It doesn't bring back the dead. It doesn't restore the years of anguish and uncertainty. Jim Walker would never get to see his sister grow up, get married, have children. He would never get to know the woman she would have become. Rodney McCoy would never get to explore the life he and Carla might have built together. Carla's parents died without knowing who had killed their daughter, carrying that pain to their graves. These are the real costs of violence, costs that extend far beyond the immediate victim, rippling out through families, communities, and time itself. Glenn McCurley didn't just take Carla's life on February 17, 1974. He stole decades of peace from her family. He poisoned the innocence of a community that had thought itself safe. He created shadows of doubt and guilt that followed survivors for the rest of their lives. And if investigators' suspicions are correct, Carla Walker wasn't his only victim. Other families may have suffered similar losses, endured similar agonies of uncertainty. Those cases may never be solved now that McCurley is dead. Those families may never receive the closure that the Walkers finally received. But the Carla Walker case stands as a testament to the possibility of justice, even against seemingly impossible odds. It demonstrates the value of careful evidence preservation, the power of advancing technology, and the importance of investigators who refuse to give up. It shows that cold cases can be solved, that killers can be caught, that truth can prevail, even after 46 years. Carla Walker was 17 years old when she died. She should have lived to see her 18th birthday, her high school graduation, her dreams of becoming a veterinarian. She should have grown old, had a life filled with joy and love and purpose. That life was stolen from her by a man who saw her as an object, as an opportunity, as something to be used and discarded. But Carla was not an object. She was a person, a daughter, a sister, a girlfriend, a friend. She was someone who smiled at people in hallways, who cared for animals, who wore a powder blue dress to a Valentine's Day dance, and dreamed of the future. She mattered then, and she matters now. Her story, tragic as it is, has helped change how we approach cold cases. Her family's persistence has inspired legislation that will help other families find answers. Her case has shown that justice is always worth pursuing, no matter how much time has passed. On February 17, 1974, Glenn McCurley tried to erase Carla Walker from the world. He failed. She is remembered. She is honored. And her case, finally solved, stands as proof that truth endures, that justice can be achieved, and that the innocent victims of violence will not be forgotten. The Valentine's dance at Western Hills High School that night was supposed to be a celebration of love. In a cruel twist of fate, it became the prelude to horror. But in another sense, it remains a story about love. The love of a family that never stopped searching. The love of investigators who never gave up. The love of a community that refused to forget. and the love that Carla herself embodied in her brief but meaningful life. Glenn McCurley is gone now, taking his secrets to the grave. But Carla Walker's memory endures, a bright light that darkness could not extinguish, a life that violence could not erase. She was 17 years old, and she deserves to be remembered not just as a victim, but as a person who mattered, who was loved, and whose story ultimately helped bring justice not only to herself, but potentially to other victims as well. In the end, that is the true victory in the Carla Walker case. Not just that a killer was caught and convicted, but that a young woman who was murdered nearly 50 years ago is still remembered, still honored, and still inspiring positive change in the world. That is a legacy that no amount of violence can destroy.